Thank you. Well, I will look at 10 years of membership for the new member states through a very specific lens, which is the lens of differentiated integration, which basically covers the case that some, or I should say many, European Union rules are not legally valid uniformly in all member states. And we can use differentiated integration data to do two things. Yeah, we can first look at, let's say, the Europeanization of the new member states, or let's say the normalization of the new member states. So, is their extent of differentiated integration becoming similar, yeah, to what old member states have in terms of differentiated integration? Are they becoming normal member states in that respect? On the other hand, we can also look at how the new member states are doing, because differentiated integration is an outcome of negotiations and decision-making in the European Union, and it tells you something, let's say, about the decision-making success or decision-making power that countries have in the European Union. And because the second aspect is a bit more prominent in my paper, I think the organizers kicked me out of the first panel and moved me to this one. This is in the context of two different projects, actually. So in a joint project together with Katharina Holzinger from the University of Constance, we have basically coded European law in terms of differentiation, so basically looked at EU rules, looked at whether they are differentiated, what countries have exemptions or derogations, and in what policy areas. And I'm taking some, the data set is not complete yet, which explains some of the deficiencies of the paper. But I took some of the data that we have, rather fresh data, to explore this issue. This is also important in the context of another project that Antoinetta introduced this morning, MaxCap, where we look at the integration capacity of the European Union, and let's say the extent of differentiated integration can also be used as a measure of the integration capacity of the EU. So enlargement is actually a good way to study differentiated integration, because if we look at the record of the European Union, it has been one of the main drivers of differentiated integration in the EU. One reason is that accession treaties usually come with a lot of transitional arrangements where new member states are either excluded from some of the benefits of membership or are given exemptions to adapt to the obligations of membership. So enlargement rounds introduce a lot of differentiation into EU law, usually, however, only for a limited time. But the long-term effect is that enlargement also increases the heterogeneity of the membership of the European Union, and therefore, let's say, creates demand for differentiation, because differentiated integration is a major instrument that the EU has to accommodate heterogeneity among its members, its preferences and capacity. What can we expect? I start here from basically a bargaining model. Yeah? So differentiated integration is something that is negotiated in accession negotiations, in the Council. So it depends, according to this theoretical perspective, on the relative bargaining power of the participating actors. And the first thing we have to keep in mind that there are two very different sorts of differentiation that I already alluded to. Differentiation can be what I call exemptive, which means new member states are exempted from some obligations of membership. There are some rules they do not have to comply with, at least for some time. But there's also discriminatory differentiation, meaning that the old member states decide to exclude the new member states from some of the benefits, and the cases of agriculture and freedom of movement of labor are the prototypical cases in that respect. So of course, new member states usually try to gain exemptions, yeah, to reduce the adaptation costs of integration, and they try to avoid discrimination because benefits of membership are what they are trying to gain. And as I already said, this is an instrument that the EU has to deal with conflicts about distributional efficiency and autonomy implications of enlargement. It's an instrument to accommodate heterogeneity in the membership and to placate potential losers of enlargement. And my first idea here, or the first assumption is that there's both a demand for differentiation, which comes from the heterogeneity of the membership, but whether you get or you don't get exemptions, or whether you can avoid discrimination, depends on your bargaining power. So I look at the factors that might explain this. And as I said, we need to distinguish these two different forms because, as we will see, the logic is very different in terms of discrimination and exemptions. So I basically make three kinds of predictions, or derive three kinds of expectations. One is that there should be variation across policy areas, there should be variation across time, and there should be variation across the new member states. Now, discrimination is something that the old member states demand and try to impose on the new member states. And one assumption is here that this will be most likely to be the case in areas that are highly politicized. Yeah? So areas that have to do with expenditure policies. Immigration is always a highly politicized issue in the EU, and that also has to do with core state powers. There might be stronger reasons for old member states to demand discrimination in these areas. Further, I expect discrimination to be more widespread in the pre-accession phase for the reason that the old member states' bargaining power is higher prior to accession than it is after accession, so they are more able to impose discrimination on the new member states when they are not actually member states yet. Then the assumption is that old member states will demand discrimination, especially if new member states are poorer, if they are weakly governed, and if they are larger. So poorer member states will demand more distribution of EU funds. Weakly governed states will create issues of implementation, efficiency, compliance, and simply larger new member states have a larger impact, yeah, on the EU than smaller ones. In addition, it should also matter how much bargaining power the new member states have. And in general, we can again say, so bargaining power means what discrimination by the old member states can you refuse without hurting yourself. And again, wealthier new member states will have more bargaining power, well-governed member states will have more bargaining power. I'm already running late. And more Eurosceptic new member states will have more bargaining power because it would hurt them less, yeah, to, at the end, say no to membership. It's a bit different for exemptions. It's basically the opposite, yeah, for very similar reasons, and because I don't have much time, I will not spell this out in detail. It's basically the opposite idea, yeah, that it's something that new member states demand, and here's a bit of a difference between demand and bargaining power. So poorer, weakly governed, smaller, and more Eurosceptic new member states will demand more exemptions. That's the assumption. But at the same time, those very countries do not have the bargaining power to really get exemptions. So, and I assume that bargaining power in the end matters most. So, whereas wealthier countries will be less likely to be discriminated, they will also get more exemptive differentiation. The same is true for better governed, more Eurosceptic, and smaller new member states. There is an alternative explanation that one should also look at, yeah? From a normative or a compliance management perspective. One can say, okay, there's a norm in the EU which is about, it's a legal norm, yeah? All member states should be treated equally. Yeah? And from a compliance management perspective, you can say, well, it might make sense for the EU, yeah, to give poorer, weaker countries some extra leeway so that they have better chances to adapt. And this would lead to completely opposite expectations on discrimination and exemptions. What are the data? Just very quickly, I already talked about the data set that we are creating. Here I'm looking at, I make the distinction between exemptions and discriminations. My unit of analysis is basically a differentiation, yeah, which is an exemption or a discrimination that one member state gets in one policy area for a certain time period. And I basically sum up the durations of both discrimination and exemptions by country and by policy area. A highly aggregate, very simple measure. I look at the 12 new member states. So that's, of course, something we can discuss. So I lump in Malta and Cyprus. I also lump in Bulgaria and Romania to the countries that we have been focusing on so far. But it gives me more cases, increases the variation, so I'm more likely to find something. So the first question is, how have the new member states fared in terms of differentiation? And as I said, I mean, this is a measure basically of normalization and Europeanization. What this graph shows is that in the early period, basically new member states had 8 times as much differentiation overall as old member states. And this has gone down to, let's say, 1.6, and tends to be decreasing. Yeah? So we do indeed see that over time, new member states have become more normal member states in terms of the extent of differentiated integration that they get. A second way of looking is at looking by variation by policy area. Now here I would mainly point you to the deep black bars, yeah, which are discrimination. And you can see it's in agriculture, it's Schengen, it's monetary policy, it's free movement of services and labor. And as I said, I mean, I would expect discrimination to happen mainly in highly politicized areas, expenditure policies, and policies that have to do with core state powers where old member states care about autonomy and efficiency issues most. And this is actually what you see. There has, of course, been worries about agricultural funds going east. There have been worries about compliance with Schengen. There have been worries about convergence regarding the euro. And in terms of free movement, discrimination has been applied to services and workers. Yeah? So things that were expected to come from east to west, but not in terms of capital, yeah, or goods, things that were mostly moving from west to east. So that seems to give some support to the assumption. Another hypothesis was, well, discrimination is more likely to occur pre-accession than past-accession. Now here, my data is only really exploratory. I should do another analysis to really get at this. But what at least I can show on the basis of the data that I have now is that indeed, if you look at the distribution of discrimination and exemption among differentiated integration, the expected values would have been for much less discrimination to occur pre-accession, and more to occur post-accession. That hasn't happened, and it's a significant result. So that also gives, let's say, first support to the expectations. Now let's look at discrimination by country. So in terms of wealth, I looked at GDP per capita. Size is square kilometers logged. I look at governance capacity based on some of the world governance indicators. And I look at Euroscepticism basically by looking at, by taking the Eurobarometer indicator and using those respondents that said Europe is a good thing minus those that Europe is a bad thing. So what we find here is that the correlations are in line with the expectations, and they are also quite significant in spite of the rather low number of cases. So that seems to confirm basically all the assumptions. I mean, I would have liked to know a little bit more about whether it's really size that matters, is it really wealth that matters, is it really governance capacity. These three items, however, are highly intercorrelated, so it's very hard to really say what matters most. Euroscepticism is not as correlated with these issues, but also is confirmed here. So that seems to be, let's say, an independent factor that we can isolate from the others. In the other cases, it's very hard to tell whether Malta has gotten the best deal, because it has been the smallest, or whether it has been the wealthiest of the new member states, or almost the wealthiest. And we see that it is completely the other way around when it comes to exemptions. So the lines go in the other direction. Here, however, most of the correlations are not statistically significant at conventional levels, except for Euroscepticism. That might have to do something, I'm not sure about that, that might have to do something with the fact that demand and supply go in different directions here. But at least it is quite clear, that the logic is indeed the other way around, that wealthier, smaller, better governed countries get more exemptions, and it's not those that would like to have more exemptions that get it, but those that have higher bargaining power. Size is an interesting case because there seem to be two things going on. If we take out Poland, it becomes a significant correlation. So Poland really being the largest of the new member states. Not the richest, but the largest, seems to have some bargaining power in getting exemptions that distorts this linear correlation, and seems to point that there are two different things going on with size. You can either be very small, so it doesn't really matter what you do, and you can get away with all kinds of exemptions, or you are large enough to really bring in your bargaining power. Okay, so this is the conclusion already. This is just an exploratory analysis. It's mainly descriptive, but it's an exploratory analysis that leads me to conclude that we find two things. Indeed, the new member states have become more normal member states in terms of the amount of differentiation. But also that differentiated integration is an issue that has a lot to do with bargaining power, and like many other things in the EU, it seems to show that also the new member states are treated differently depending on their characteristics, mainly those characteristics that feed into their negotiating power in European Union decision-making and treaty-making. Thank you.